Could Keir Starmer do the unthinkable? Between 2021 and 2024, almost 5 million migrants flooded Britain on temporary visas. Most were low-skilled workers from third-world countries, deliberately imported to suppress wages and keep inflation under control. 7% of the UK population changed in just 3 years. This was the biggest demographic shift in the past 1,000 years. From January of this year, and with every month that passes, this so-called Boriswave is becoming eligible for indefinite leave to remain. If their right to settle here permanently is not stopped, the consequences for Britain, for us all, will be catastrophic. Join me as I explain how Keir Starmer might be about to make the worst decision of his premiership. I'm Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. I'm occasionally asked who I believe is the worst Prime Minister in British history. For many years I unequivocally bestowed the dubious honour on Tony Blair, architect of the post-revolutionary Britain we see around us. However, we've had such a steady stream of utterly rotten Prime Ministers in recent years that I now have to seek greater clarification when people ask me that question. What do you mean by worst, I say? If you mean the most sinister and dangerous, then yes, Tony Blair is undoubtedly the worst Prime Minister. But if by worst you mean the most incompetent and reckless, then I'd have to say Boris Johnson. It is Boris we must blame for the billions wasted during COVID, such as on the furlough scheme, etc., which increased government debt. And it is Boris we must blame for betraying the British people over Brexit. Brexit was a vote about immigration. Take back control meant stopping immigration at our borders. Yet Boris deliberately misconstrued that, resulting in levels of immigration that not even Tony Blair could have imagined or countenanced. The so-called Boriswave, the importation into this country of millions of people, a vast number from culturally incompatible lands, has changed the demographics of this country more than any other single act in the past 1,000 years. If one looks at official data, one will see that between 2021 and 2024, net migration to the UK was between 2.5 and 2.6 million people. Now that's a shocking figure, but it doesn't tell the full story. In fact, it only tells half the story. In fact, the true figures are far worse, because 2.5 to 2.6 million is the net migration figure. The real number of migrants, the gross figure, who came to the UK between 2021 and 2024 is approximately 4.8 million, 3.6 million of those from outside the EU. Just let that sink in. 7% of the UK population arrived in just 3 years. Most low-skilled workers from Asia and Africa. As I've said repeatedly on this channel, when it comes to demographics, net migration figures are all but useless. Net migration figures look at the gross number and then subtract those who have left the country over the same period. So if 5 million arrive but another 2 million leave, the net figure will be 3 million. But net migration figures are only useful for helping calculate things like population size, pressure on infrastructure and public services, etc. Net figures obscure the reality of demographic change, because the millions of people who are leaving the UK and the millions of people who are coming in are vastly different. They are not a like-for-like swap. We are losing many of our brightest and best. British people who are moving to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the USA, Spain and elsewhere. Europeans who are moving back home. And they are being replaced by low-skilled migrants, often from culturally incompatible lands. This is the Boriswave. A deliberate attempt by Boris Johnson to restrain inflation by flooding Britain with cheap workers in order to suppress wages. But the dire consequences of this move are devastating for our society, our culture, and our economy. If you believe in the value of the work the New Culture Forum does, please do become a member. You can receive several benefits ranging from exclusive member content, invitations to private events, visits to our studios here, a chance to meet the NCF team, and a lot more. You can join via the link below or via our website. Thank you, and back to the show. Immigration accounted for over 99% of the population increase in the UK during this period, with 2022 to 2024 marking the fastest population growth since the 1940s. The future of the Boriswave is a matter of urgent concern. Many of these immigrants arrived in the UK on temporary visas. However, as the law stands, after 5 years of residency, they are eligible for indefinite leave to remain. Indefinite leave to remain is the moment that a temporary visa becomes a permanent entitlement to settlement. It grants the right to live and work here without restriction and opens the path to citizenship. Entry into Britain is one thing. Permanence is another. Ladies and gentlemen, the first wave of the Boriswave technically became eligible for indefinite leave to remain in January of this year. As each month, each week and each day passes, more and more of these almost 5 million migrants might be eligible to remain in the UK permanently. Keir Starmer understands that this issue is political dynamite. He has therefore come out with some very mediocre and milquetoast plans to fool you into thinking he's got a grip of the situation. The government's new earned settlement model proposes some notable changes to the system. The standard qualifying period for indefinite leave to remain would be extended from the current 5 years to 10 years for most sponsored work routes. And if passed, that would certainly be an improvement, although I have long proposed the requirement be extended to at least 15 years. In fact, I would do away with indefinite leave to remain and simply have citizenship after 15 years potentially, if not longer. Crucially, however, Labour's new rules were set to apply retrospectively to those who had arrived during the 2021-24 Boriswave migration surge. However, as always, the devil is in the detail, because there are ways for high-skilled earners, asylum seekers and others to fast-track the 10-year requirement and get leave to remain after only 5 years, or even 3 years in some cases. But even with this longer 10-year pathway, the Home Office projects approximately 1.6 million settlement grants between this year and 2030, peaking at roughly 450,000 people in 2028, which is around 4 times the recent average. In other words, even under Labour's stricter rules, Britain is heading into the largest settlement wave in modern history. Nevertheless, Starmer's proposed changes to leave to remain are certainly an improvement on what we have already. But here's the problem. The Prime Minister is facing rebellion from Labour backbenchers who are outraged over these changes and are trying to stop them. The loony left want the Boriswave to settle here permanently, and Downing Street appears to be listening to them. If weak and feeble Starmer caves in to his fanatical backbenchers and commits yet another policy U-turn, the consequences for Britain will be catastrophic. If you want to understand whether immigration is truly under control, you look not at visas issues, but at how easily those visas convert into permanent status. Other countries understand this very well. Take the United Arab Emirates, for instance, the UAE, where visas are relatively straightforward to obtain, but there is no automatic pathway to citizenship for most foreigners. It's highly discretionary and rare. Now consider what happens if Starmer does cave in to his backbenchers. A return to a 5-year pathway for most migrants, combined with the scrapping of retrospective application to the Boriswave, would accelerate hundreds of thousands of settlements into a compressed time frame. This would be a fiscal disaster, because settlement carries full access to welfare, social housing eligibility, long-term NHS use, and family reunification rights that themselves generate further migration flows. Family migration is a key challenge. Even if a migrant works and earns enough to contribute taxes, the fiscal balance changes immediately once their entire family settles permanently and becomes eligible for the full suite of state support. The Treasury has previously acknowledged that certain migration routes, particularly family migration, impose significant long-term costs in schooling and child-related benefits. Education spending alone averages thousands of pounds per pupil per year. If you add in healthcare, housing support and tax credits, and the cumulative fiscal burden over decades is substantial. Family migration is therefore central to the settlement debate. Accelerating settlement does not merely grant status to an individual worker. It cements multi-decade claims on public services. And bringing forward hundreds of thousands of such settlements during a period of already strained public finances would shift long-term liabilities onto a tax base that is already under historic pressure. And then, of course, there are the other pressures on infrastructure, on housing, on public services such as GP appointments, and let us not forget the cultural and social consequences of importing vast numbers of people who do not understand Britain and the British way of life. Yet internal Labour opposition to stricter settlement rules has been fierce. A bloc of backbench MPs has condemned the retrospective element as unfair and even un-British. Can you believe it? Unions are claiming workforces in health and care would be impacted. Letters have circulated demanding that ministers abandon the tougher approach. For a Prime Minister who is already desperately fending off leadership challenges, the temptation to cave must be strong. But conceding would carry consequences beyond party management. Only 2 weeks ago, the Home Office boasted of imposing some of the longest waits for settlement in Europe. If those reforms are dismantled before they even take effect, the conclusion will be unavoidable. The rhetoric of control was indeed only rhetoric. The settlement wave is one of the greatest issues this country faces. Yet it is being swept under the carpet. The question now is the speed and scale with which it hits the public purse. Starmer can either manage it responsibly or unleash it prematurely for short-term political convenience. If he buckles now, he will be reopening the very floodgates his government claimed to have shut. Voters can quite clearly see that restore control was merely a slogan. This country deserves better. This nation needs a new government capable of reversing mass immigration immediately, and which won't be swayed by the loony left. In the New Culture Forum's new book, Immigration, the Betrayal of Britain, available via our website, I write a chapter in which I lay out in great detail how a new right-wing government can reverse mass immigration, and crucially, how such a new government can castrate the blob, the civil service, the judiciary, the quangos and the House of Lords, those institutions who have blocked previous governments' attempts to get tough on immigration. Because there is no point having great policies if our elite institutions prevent the government from implementing them. One thing is certain: urgent action is required now. Thank you.